In the United States, the White House has confirmed that former President Barack Obama explicitly warned Donald Trump not to hire Michael Flynn as his national security advisor. Donald Trump ignored the advice but was forced to sack Mr. Flynn within weeks of his inauguration because the retired general had lied about his contact with Russia's ambassador to the US. Ann Barker reports.
Today's revelations shed new light on what the Trump administration knew about Michael Flynn before he was appointed National Security Advisor. Just 48 hours after the US election, Donald Trump met then-President Barack Obama at the Oval Office for a wide-ranging briefing. Mr. Trump later praised his predecessor in glowing terms, and Barack Obama for the first time expressed optimism that the incoming president might oversee a smooth transition to government. But now Donald Trump's press secretary, Sean Spicer, has confirmed it was that meeting where Barack Obama warned Donald Trump not to hire Michael Flynn as his security advisor.
But it's true that President Obama made it known that he wasn't exactly a fan of General Flynn's, which is frankly shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, that given that General Flynn had worked for President Obama, was an outspoken critic of President Obama's shortcomings, specifically as it related to his lack of strategy confronting ISIS and other threats around that were facing America.
Though Mr. Spicer questioned why Barack Obama hadn't cancelled Mr. Flynn's security clearance if he was so concerned.
I think if you know what we knew at the time, which is that the security clearance that he had been reapproved in April of that year, and they took, not only did they reapprove it, but then they took no steps to suspend it. So the question has to be, what did they do if they had real concerns beyond just not liking him for some of the comments that he made?
Sean Spicer's comments come as the former acting US Attorney General Sally Yates testifies for the first time before a Senate panel about Michael Flynn's contacts with Russia's ambassador to the US, Sergei Kislyak. Ms. Yates has told senators that Mr. Flynn's secret conversations with the Russian envoy in the lead-up to the US election left him vulnerable to blackmail.
We were concerned that the American people had been misled about the underlying conduct and what General Flynn had done. And additionally, that we weren't the only ones that knew all of this, that the Russians also knew about what General Flynn had done, and the Russians also knew that General Flynn had misled the vice president and others. Because in the media accounts, it was clear from the vice president and others that they were repeating what General Flynn had told them. And that this was a problem because not only did we believe that the Russians knew this, but that they likely had proof of this information. And that created a compromise situation, a situation where the national security advisor essentially could be blackmailed by the Russians.
Ms. Yates says she warned a White House counsel about Mr. Flynn in late January when she became aware that he'd lied to the US Vice President Mike Pence about the nature of his contact with the Russian envoy, and specifically that he'd discussed US sanctions against Russia. Mr. Flynn resigned in February.
Why does it matter to DOJ if one White House official lies to another White House official? And so we explained to him it was a whole lot more than that, and went back over the same concerns that we had raised with them the prior day, that the concern first about the underlying conduct itself, that he had lied to the vice president and others, the American public had been misled, and then importantly, that every time this lie was repeated, and the misrepresentations were getting more and more specific as they were coming out, every time that happened, it increased the compromise. And to state the obvious, you don't want your national security advisor compromised with the Russians.
Sally Yates has now come in for criticism over her role in the Flynn scandal becoming public. She's refused to disclose where her knowledge came from, and President Trump has now questioned whether she'd leaked high-level intelligence to the media, tweeting, quote, "Ask Sally Yates under oath if she knows how classified information got into the newspapers soon after she explained it to White House counsel," unquote. At least 3 former Obama administration officials say the previous president had warned Donald Trump against hiring Michael Flynn. He'd already been sacked in 2014 as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency on the grounds of mismanagement and an unsuitable temperament. And in testimony before the same committee, James Clapper, the former Director of National Intelligence, has warned of the dangers of Russia's meddling in last year's election.
In conclusion, Russia's influence activities in the run-up to the 2016 election constituted the high water mark of their long-running efforts since the 1960s to disrupt and influence our elections. They must be congratulating themselves for having exceeded their wildest expectations with a minimal expenditure of resource. And I believe they are now emboldened to continue such activities in the future, both here and around the world, and to do so even more intensely.
Mr. Clapper has called on all Americans to do what they can to counter the Russian threat.
If there has ever been a clarion call for vigilance and action against a threat to the very foundation of our democratic political system, this episode is it. I hope the American people recognize the severity of this threat and that we collectively counter it before it further erodes the fabric of our democracy.
That's the former Director of US National Intelligence, James Clapper, Anne Barker with that report.